It was strictly against the rules for any probationer to be on ward territory in civvies. It was especially ultra vires, however, to dress in one's uniform when not on duty, which rather left her stuck between a rock and a hard place. Jane was well worth a slight risk, however. And from the sanctuary of the ward kitchen, and safe in the knowledge that this was the appointed hour for all ward sisters' supper, Elizabeth bent and peered out to see if she could catch a glimpse of her darling sister. In the first 5 seconds, the answer was no. A 4th year just going off duty, and the ward staff nurse slipping into the visitors' anteroom, but no one else. Elizabeth's heart sank at the possibility that Jane had been sent for a break herself, and she might face a long walk back to the main nurse's home without a cheering visit with her sister. And then, with much jubilation ensuing, Jane chose that moment to pop out of one of the little cubicle rooms lined up along the walls of the intensive care ward. For a second or two she bustled up the ward, looking a perfect angel in her sky-blue 3rd year's dress and white cap. Then Elizabeth's discreet, but frantic gestures and low whistle, as she leaned out of the ward kitchen, caught Jane's eye. Oh, she moved a good bit quicker now, and with her lovely rosebud lips compressed together, making her just a tiny fraction less divinely lovely. Reaching the kitchen, she was moving at a fair lick, and practically skidded inside, rushing Elizabeth back and out through the ward kitchen door, too. Lizzy. She reproved her. Didn't I tell you not to do this again? You'll get into real trouble if you carry on like this. They don't take it lightly, you know. I'm so sorry, Elizabeth said contritely. But when she flung her arms around her sister for a hug, and drew back with such a dumbbell expression of well-meaning inept cluelessness, Jane couldn't help but laugh. Which was Elizabeth's cunning plan from the beginning. I've missed you, she added, coaxingly. With you working these stupid evening shifts, and moving into the annex, I hardly see you lately. Oh, I know, darling, Jane said regretfully. It is dreadful, but what can I do? Well, you can light up and loan me 5 minutes of Jane time, Elizabeth suggested, proffering her sister the open pack of ciggies in her jacket pocket. Because I've had a rather discombobulating day, and I'd like to snivel a bit on darling Jane girl's shoulder. Darling, gross, Jane said automatically, accepting a cigarette, and then stuffed it in her apron pocket. A moth's shadow passed over her lovely Grecian features, under the evening lamp on the little step outside the kitchen. All right, my love, I'll give you 2 minutes, but I must just go and check on our new arrival, first. Poor chap, he got all smashed up in a dreadful crash with a lorry at the junction up the road last night, and they only just took him off life support in Cass and moved him over. She hurried off through the kitchen, leaving Elizabeth putting her own unlit ciggy back in the pack, and gripping the banister of the railings on the step. She gazed out at the dim, lovely, dusky greenery of Pemberley. Lovely and verdant it certainly was, but not entertaining enough to long distract her mind from wondering what Jane might be up to. The girl, it occurred to her finally, had been gone a sight too long to be congruent with her stated intent. This was quite enough for Elizabeth to be up and doing. The thought that she might make herself useful in an interesting medical case was an itch that simply didn't bear leaving alone. Jane wouldn't mind a bit if she went and offered what assistance an ignorant probationer might be capable of, she was sure. Or at least, she was sure that Jane would always regard her infractions with a forgiving eye, after the fact. Elizabeth did, however, have enough native caution to be extremely careful and wary in slipping back onto the ward. Once there it was very near as quiet as the grave, with no sign of her sister, just a second year pulling dressings out of the store cupboard, with her back to Elizabeth, and the staff nurse with her head down writing reports at the reception desk, sitting next to a half-asleep houseman. But Jane's absence was explained when Elizabeth pattered down the ward and came to the new arrival's cubicle, around a little corner at the other end of the ward from the sister's office. Jane was inside, with the new patient. Elizabeth hesitated, and refrained from charging in and announcing herself. Instead she just leaned over and peeked through the window in the wall, and the reinforced glass in the cubicle door. Jane was standing holding the fellow's hand, or most probably simply taking his pulse. The door shut out the whistling wheeze of the ventilator, the drip of the saline bag that had been set up. But Elizabeth could see the chap's eyes flutter open a little, as Jane smiled down at him like a Botticelli angel. Lord, but he'd been knocked about a bit, even leaving aside internal damage, he was one red and purple mass of abrasions and contusions. In spite of that, and in spite of what a wreck he must be feeling, He gazed up at Jane trustfully, just like any other of her patients. That was the kind of devotion that Jane habitually inspired, and it gave Elizabeth a slight sinking feeling, to be honest. She had chosen medicine, originally, rather than nursing, for good reason, she felt. It wasn't that she didn't care about people, or patients. But she couldn't help but doubt, a little, her capacity for the kind of dedicated, unselfish devotion that made Jane such a natural nurse. Her own gifts were distinctly more coolly analytical. Medicine offered a fascinating array of interesting problems, to be wrestled with until they cried uncle and she might conquer them. But now she was well launched upon a nursing career, and might as well resign herself to it. With a slight squint, she read the tiny print of the name tag pasted onto the door, over the little pigeonhole containing the patient's medical notes. Bingley, Charles, Elizabeth Reed. 29, brought in after motor vehicular accident. 4 broken ribs, internal injuries, spleen damage, concussion, broken wrist, confusion. Well, yes. Elizabeth imagined that he probably was rather confused. With only a slight hesitation, she lifted her hand to grasp the door handle, and insert herself into this little human drama. Jane wouldn't mind. I really wouldn't do that, if I were you, interjected a dry, cool voice, the words coming from just a little way behind her. Elizabeth froze for just a moment, before turning around. Damn it. Maybe Jane was right after all. Good girls follow the rules, right? Elizabeth had never felt much actively called to such a course, or not as a matter of principle, but only when her heart was in it. It was Mr. Darcy, and Elizabeth felt no surprise whatsoever. After such a day as this one, who else could it possibly be? She opened her mouth a little, but no words came out. What was there to say, after all? She knew damn well the position she was in, and had prepared no handy excuses just in case, as might have been advisable. You do know that you're not supposed to be here, don't you? He asked. He skimmed a disparaging look up and down, taking in her civvies, pencil skirt, lowish round toe heels and a nice cashmere sweater that Kitty had knitted her for her last birthday. Elizabeth felt that she was quite presentable, it was true, but still it couldn't be denied that it was nothing near regulation would wear. And you're certainly not appropriately dressed, either, he noted. Hellfire, Elizabeth mentally cursed. She was almost certainly headed for a heck of a dressing down over this, and that was if she wasn't even tossed off the course and bounced out of St. Pemberley's. Which, she suddenly found, would be a very bad thing. True, nursing was her second choice, if you could even call it that, with her mother pushing and harrying her into it, at the time. But she was still involved in patient care, still learning, becoming part of a hospital community and making friends and connections every day. She was building something close to the career she'd originally planned. She was going to be a nurse, and that was something worthwhile in itself. Well, she hoped she was still going to be a nurse, anyhow. Honestly, she had no words in the moment, though. Her brain had quite frozen up, and she opened her mouth only to stutter, well, I think. Oh, but he took not the slightest notice, and it wasn't as if it was any surprise from the great god of St. Pemberley's operating theatre, after all. Instead he just looked away, with his face screwed up into a look that Elizabeth interpreted as something between anger, exasperation and impatience. Then he looked back at her. I really ought to report you, he said meditatively, although rather more as if he were arguing it out with himself, rather than speaking to Elizabeth, who held her breath to cool her porridge, because this seemed like a promising juncture, and Lord knew anything she had to say might perfectly well ruin it. However, it appears that it's your lucky day, he added. He cast a look in at the cubicle where Jane was checking the functioning of the drip bag, tapping at the tubing, and continued, I have rather more pressing concerns at the moment. I strongly advise that you get yourself off this ward before a sister, or anyone else less forgiving or otherwise engaged than myself catches you here. He grimaced as he spoke, his eyes wandering away from her again to the room they stood outside of. Elizabeth almost turned away and tiptoed off, thanking her lucky stars, but he had yet a few more words to add, it seemed. And for heaven's sake, he said, quite sharply, now, don't repeat the offence, nurse. I would hope that as a Pemberley's nurse, you're too intelligent for that. Are you? Please prove me right in giving you the benefit of the doubt, here. The warning was topped off with the curtest of nods. He turned away from her, put his hand to the cubicle doorknob and left her standing there, simultaneously